Who are Iranians? What do they say? What do they think? What are they capable of?
Why revolution? Who do you believe was behind it? The CIA, the Russians, the Marxists? I've heard all kinds of theories.
I really believe that if the revolution had not happened, Iran should be by now South Korea of the Middle East.
Not
Instead,
the
we have
North
become
Korea.
the North Korea.
The new Iran. What does that look like?
There is a positive note to it. America might say, well, we want to leave them alone. They won't leave you alone. It has to be declawed. If not now, when? How many more generations have to be sacrificed?
Your Highness Crown Prince of Iran, welcome to PragerU. It is a great honor to have you here.
I'm very glad to be here today and talk to you and be on your program. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, this is going to be a fascinating conversation, and I have many questions for you. But I actually want to start by doing something that I typically don't do at the beginning of an interview, and that is to thank you. I will surely thank you at the end, but I feel like you deserve a thank you from many of my Iranian friends who I have here living in the United States, who expressed to me that you have given them so much hope. Not only have you given them hope that things will get better in Iran, in your country, but you have also been the embodiment of what Iranians are really. And for many Americans living in the United States, especially of my generation and younger, our experience with Iran has been terrorism and killing and death and terrible human rights abuses and, the treatment of women and what we've heard has happened to young women like Masha Amini. And so when we hear about that regime in Iran and we associate all of that evil, it's been a blessing to us to know people like you and like the Iranians who do live here in the United States, who, in my opinion, are some of the most reasonable people I know. They're incredibly kind. They're incredibly warm. Best food ever. Almost all of them are successful entrepreneur, totally rational people. And I just have such a huge love for the Iranian people that reconciling the huge difference between the Iranians that I know and people like you versus the Iranians that I hear about in the Middle East, it's I have a great sense of gratitude to people like you who've really held up what Iranians are about. And so I just want to start by just saying thank you. Thank you for everything you've already done.
Well, I'm just doing my job, and it's my duty to serve the best interests of my compatriots by at least being their voice to begin with, and hopefully then some.
And you have been. For people who know very little about Iran, it is the more you study Persia and the region, the more actually fascinating it becomes, because that region has given birth to so many different societies, I guess, in some ways. Can you describe to us what has happened over, let's say, the last 100 years or so, since your grandfather became the ruler and then your father, and what happened with you and why did you end up in exile?
Mm-hmm. Actually, when you look at the legacy, the way people now look upon what my grandfather and my father did as the architect of modern Iran, in fact, they call my family the Iran building family, demonstrates that the view was how we can bring Iran from the, sort of underdeveloped country where most people were uneducated, illiterate, to a country that in the 70s was thriving, had a strong economy. Iranians were educating themselves, were coming back to Iran to bring in whatever was necessary in terms of development and infrastructure. So I think it's really in the last 100 years, because my grandfather stepped into the scene towards the second quarter of the 20th century, 1926, more or less. And, he served first as the commander of the armies, was prime minister, and then he was prompted into the scene as a result of the previous dynasty, sort of like shying away from carrying their responsibilities. And he was called upon to step in and sort of literally take over power. And in fact, my grandfather wanted to first establish a republic in Iran, based on the model of Ataturk that he admired a lot next door in Turkey. Mm. And interestingly enough, the clerics at the time and many of the people in the Iranian sort of elite were saying, it won't work here. You should, crown yourself as the next king and form the new dynasty, which is what he did. So that's how it all started. And so for about 50 years, the Pahlavi dynasty was in place until we reached the point where the revolution happened. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that. So I think Iran really began to flourish when we started, especially post-Second World War, where we were able to start producing our oil and selling it at a higher price. We created enough revenue so you can start really spending it on copious projects of modernization, development, factories, dams, roads, schools, everything that was needed. And that's how we started getting some traction. And Iranians, at the time of my grandfather, Iran's income per capita was around $400. Towards the end, it was over 2,800, and it was sort of like really increasing. And so I think people saw that Iran is progressively on track for development, for prosperity, for people's life improving at every level. But I think the most important element that, especially now, in contrast to where Iran was and what it is under this regime, is how much was done, especially for the women in Iran. Mm-hmm. And that would really happen at the time of my father. Of course, my grandfather was the first one to say that people should be free to wear the veil or not, the hijab issue. And of course, he led by example by having his own daughters go out in public without wearing any, veil. And that was one way to liberate women from having to be castigated into, that. And the symbolism of it is so obvious because even when Mahsa happened a year ago, you see how much that is a symbol of where we were. And women were integrated in all form or shape into not just members of society, but actual participant in governance. Iranian women achieved suffrage 4 years before the women in Switzerland did.
Wow.
There were family laws to protect families and women's rights. They were given opportunities to become ministers, judges, even serve in the armed forces. It was a completely different situation as opposed to what this regime has done and turned them into second-class citizens. So I think that's a little bit of modern history of where Iran started to go. And I really believe that if the revolution had not happened, Iran should be by now, if not the second Japan of the Middle East, but at least the South Korea of the Middle East.
Not
Instead,
the
we have
North
become
Korea.
the North Korea. So it's not the people that have changed or our resources being depleted. It's just the nature of the regime. And in fact, I'd like to take the opportunity, since you talk about Iran and Iranians, we feel sometimes very frustrated whenever something happens, media or political leaders say, Iran did this, Iran did that. I will urge you to help us correct that by saying, this is not Iran and Iranians. This is the regime in Iran. So it's the Islamic regime, not the Iranian people. That's one way to distinguish the aspiration of Iranians from the doing of the regime. That perception by itself is important. At the beginning, especially when the hostages were taken in the American embassy in Tehran, and of course Khomeini had just hit the scene, I remember during that time leading to the revolution, I was still in Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock, Texas. And I can already see that sense of hostility against Iranians who had no fault whatsoever just to be Iranian. My own wife, who was studying in school in the Bay Area, was beaten up by some of her classmates just because she was an Iranian. But I think we have come a long way. I think many Iranians, especially those living in the United States, and for Americans who have interacted, example yourself, with Iranians, by now should know the difference between what actual Iranians believe or think as opposed to what the regime is projecting as being, something that is totally alien to us in terms of values, in terms of beliefs, in terms of principles. And that's where all the problems started and continues to exist.
You describe Iran as this prosperous economic society, right? And the revolution happens. If people were happy in Iran, presumably they were doing well financially and things were growing, why revolution? Who do you believe was behind it? Was it really from within? Or was it Carter? Was it the UK? Was it the fight over oil? Was it the Russians, the Marxists? I mean, I've heard all kinds of theories on who took Iran down and why. And I'm curious, what do you believe is the truth?
Well, there were two major groups that were opposed to the way Iran was, the direction it had taken. Everything that I explained regarding women's rights and things that were happening, the clergy didn't look at that very favorably. And Khomeini, in fact, started everything when my father instigated the white revolution at the time that brought in all these elements. He was the first one to start speaking against it and build that sort of rejection by the Islamists or the fundamentalists there. On the other hand, you had the Marxist forces who didn't like this rapprochement with the West in general and, in their sort of anti-imperialist, anti-Western rhetoric, sort of partnered with the Islamists. And that was the root cause that brought about that moment where there were forces at play that took it to that level of leading to this revolution. And interestingly enough, I think that now the children of that generation who in 1957, Iranian calendar, 57, which is 1979, were part of it, turned back to their parents and said, what the hell were you thinking? What was lacking? The maximum we could argue might be that maybe in terms of political liberalization, we were not quite there yet, but we were going in that direction. And they were saying, well, a lot of reforms could have happened and we could have avoided having a revolution. But instead, we opted to bring in some cleric that we believed would be just a very benign, sort of symbolic leader retiring in the city of Qom and allowing for all these promised liberties. And instead, we ended up with what we have. And by the time we realized what it was too late. And contrary to that, there's been decades of insisting on bringing reform to a regime that is irreformable. So it's the sort of tragedy in all this is that the opportunity cost to Iran and Iranians has been huge in terms of these past 4.5 decades since the revolution. However, there is a positive note to it, as crazy as it may sound. But it is really in the sense of some of the cornerstones of liberty and justice and the rule of law in any democracy, and that is the separation of church from state. In other words, a secular system. I want to emphasize this point as strongly as I can, because I think from the point of view of Americans, when they look at the American Constitution, when they look at the fact that Thomas Jefferson was inspired by Cyrus the Great to build in those values of human rights and liberty into the American Bill of Rights and Constitution, there's something that has to do with the history of our country. And we are proud as descendants of Cyrus to be represented in that. But what can we do for ourselves? And how can we have the same system in our country? Because a lot of people say, well, Iran was a Muslim country. How do we deal with these religious elements? Is this really what they are? Not. And in fact, Iran was perhaps one of the most secular countries in the region before the revolution. But we had to experience directly the consequences of a religious dictatorship. It's a little bit like the Inquisition in Europe that led to Enlightenment. And now you're talking about an Islamic Inquisition in Iran and what could happen post that. In terms of returning to our roots and a country where different religions lived together side by side for centuries. Christians, Zoroastrians, Jews, Baha'is, Muslims. And we never had issues until this regime emerged. And that's a very important lesson that Iranians had to learn the hard way, but puts us in the best possible position to navigate this challenge and land on solid grounds in the future once this regime is finally brought down.
So do you think that the people who voted for the revolution, were they duped? Is that what happened? Were they basically tricked? Was it that the Marxists and the Islamists came together and created this new version of politicized Islam that controlled the media and lied to people, and people didn't realize really what they're stepping into? Because it's almost like an oxymoron to combine Marxism with religious Islam, because Marxism is really not about religion. And so the marriage of those two seemed quite bizarre, except for the purpose of political control and corruption. And so were the Iranians basically tricked Was it planned that this would happen, or is it just a terrible accident and just a very, very unfortunate situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, you can imagine that in these 4 decades, ever since I was plunged into the scene of Iranian politics and opposition politics and what have you, I had discussions with many Iranians, including many who were the most aggressive opponents of my father's regime, belonging to the same category of people you just described. And in our conversation, they often said that, we now realize what we didn't know then. And most of them admit that we made a mistake. But the truth is that it was such a frenzy, it was such a euphoria that you could not have a rational discussion. We had university professors swearing that they saw with their own eyes Khomeini's face in the moon. You're not talking about an uneducated person be subject to some propaganda or brainwashing. This is a university professor saying that. So when the intelligentsia or intellectuals fall into those trappings, they didn't even know what Khomeini really stood for. Nobody had really read his pamphlet, which if you read today, was, this is just some badness behind it. And the whole process, which was extremely opaque, obscure, Khomeini started by saying Islamic Republic, and that's it. And people were called to a referendum without even knowing what it's been proposed, voting in plain view with somebody with a Kalashnikov standing on a barrel, and you had to throw either a green or a red, in plain view. So what I'm trying to say is that as it was evolving, the momentum was such in that frenzy, and mostly instigated by these two groups, that what could have been possibly been done? Some people retrospectively say, well, maybe the regime was too slow to react to that demand. And I'm not saying there were legitimate demands for liberalization. And a lot of honest, genuine liberals at the time were not wrong. And my father actually wanted to do that. Why would you educate a nation knowing that tomorrow they will have more demands and more need for participation? But we should not forget that this was at the time of the Cold War. This is at the time that some of these groups were affiliated during the bidding of a foreign power. The Tudeh party was basically the instrument of intervention in Iran on behalf of Moscow. It was very clear. Maybe in today's generation, they don't quite relate to that era, but that's how things were at the time. Anyway, the point is that as soon as the regime took over, they started to immediately take on the intelligentsia. They closed universities. They threw professors in jail. What I'm saying is that there was a sudden realization that we cannot stay in this country. They were immediately persecuted if they were a religious minority. Baha'is, Jews had to escape. The first exodus of Iranians that came out of Iran and were lucky enough to be able to escape because of their political persuasions or because of their religious beliefs or because they were members of the previous regime. Anyway, there was a massive brain drain that started early on. And it started creating what today you see in terms of the Iranian diaspora and how affluent and capable they are in terms of creativity. Many of them run corporations, industries, medical centers. And that should be, again, a way for whether you're an American or a foreigner looking, okay, who are Iranians? What do they say? What do they think? What are they capable of? In contrast to what this regime is projecting, that's where you can see the contrast. That's what people in Iran today see as a contrast. The children that were on the streets of Iran protesting in latter years, in various moments, they were the ones who are no longer duped. They do their own due diligence. Yeah. They do their own research. So there's no more naivete that did exist in 1978, 79 at the time of the revolution.
Do you think that any of the Iranians have any resentment towards the West? Are they blaming the CIA or, or the UK? I mean, is there any of that type of resentment there?
Look, let me give you a tacit example of the expectation that exists in Iran in terms of how can the free world come to our help. During the Green Movement, there were a lot of slogans. It was during the Obama administration. And you could see signs that people were holding in the English language to any camera covering it. Clearly, they were not practicing their linguistic skills. They were trying to send you a message. In fact, they were chanting Obama, Obama, Yaba Una, Yaba Ma, which means either with them or with us. Pick your side. And throughout the years, you saw that the messaging coming from Iran, at a time that there was no social media, which makes it more accessible to see what people actually think, was not covered by foreign media. So it was always in the mindset of dealing with the regime, falling into the trappings of, well, there are more moderate elements rather than the more hardcore. Maybe we can reason with them. Maybe we can have a strategy of behavior change and a policy of trying to cut a deal with them and what have you, while Iranians were getting repressed at home. And I think the biggest reproach that Iranians have towards countries like America or its allies in the Western world is that haven't you yet seen the difference between us and our values and our aspirations, which is the very same thing that you as Americans or French enjoy in terms of liberty and justice and human rights in your countries. And instead of helping us get rid of the regime that is taking all the rights from us, you insist on dealing with them over our head and throw us under the bus every time that we face this crisis. That, I think, is what frustrates many of my compatriots back home. It's just how else are we supposed to defend ourselves unarmed, unequipped against an extremely repressive regime? Why is it that when you know this regime is repressing us at home and is conducting its proxy war abroad, not only you don't put more pressure on them, you reward them by releasing more money to them, which of course is not going to be spent on people in Iran and their economic situation. It's going to be spent on this whole proxy war. And that is adding insult to injury. That's really what I think most Iranians today look upon, why it is that we are being completely ignored and thrown under the bus.
So interesting. Why is it that Iran is involved in proxy wars? Why are they doing this to the world?
Okay, first thing you have to realize is that you're not talking about a conventional government that wants to take care of its citizenry. This was not the objective of Khomeini in the first place. Khomeini simply looked at Iran as a launching pad to export an ideology, to create a modern-day Shiite caliphate, to dominate the region and beyond. In order to do that, you have to be able to use every tool at your disposal in what way you can impose that in the region and beyond. And the proxy war is part of that strategy. And from the very beginning, in fact, the IRGC is mandated in carrying out the arms part of helping that exportation of this ideology around the globe. It's in their mission statement. And oddly enough, there's nowhere mentioned the word Iran in that organization. Don't say it's not an Iranian entity. It's called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in support of the regime. Why was it created? And I know the people who are involved in that creation, because they knew that they cannot trust the army. And therefore, they had to create a buffer between the army, and it started very early on, including when the Iran-Iraq war started. And it was supposed to be a guarantee of protecting the regime from a potential military coup against it by the military.
So a second military that is loyal and reports directly to the current Islamic regime.
And basically for protecting them by not trusting the military and creating that buffer. What happened, of course, next is that this organization became more and more a mafia-like organization, getting involved in every aspect of control and commerce and business in Iran. So that's why it is an entity that is actually powerful because it's in symbiosis with the regime.
How big is it? How many people work for this IRGC?
It's certainly, if not more than the military, or even if there are some military components, a lot of it is controlled by the IRGC. But it has become a point that they really have a lot of clout. And if you look at every time the regime has been intervening regionally, whether in Syria or even in Lebanon and other places, there's some kind of an IRGC entity involved in that aspect. So you may be funding Hamas or Hezbollah, but there is an element of the IRGC involved in all these characteristics, which brings me to the point of why it is that I think if there's no shift in policy in terms of how do we deal with this regime, how do we weaken this regime, whether it's its proxies or whether it's the regime itself, one of the issues on the table, which I think should be part of that policy, is the IRGC should be sanctioned and placed on a list of terrorist organizations. Some governments are looking at that, finding the legal way to do that. But if you do not show the Iranian people that we know the evil work that this regime is doing against you in repression at home and what it's doing in its proxy war, you cannot expect either Iranians at home or our immediate neighbors like the Israelis or the Saudis to think there's an actual means of responding to the regime. And in the meantime, what do we do in dealing with this situation? So it's not just limited to Iran. And why is it that it impacts America at the end of the day? Because I know many times I've heard Americans say, well, it's all the way over there. Why should we be dragged into it anymore? We had a bad experience in Afghanistan. We have a bad experience in Iraq. Once again, as taxpayers, we have to fund all these things. But none of this needs to happen when it comes to Iran. But you cannot hope to have an equal playing field where you don't empower the people of Iran without taking the teeth or the fangs out of this tiger that the regime is. It has to be declawed, literally. So you cannot have a chance of bringing real change in nations that want to have change by continuing to, in fact, reward this regime by giving them more means that they shouldn't have had in the first place. And that's the question that many Iranians ask. It says, you're not punishing the regime, you're in fact emboldening them by giving them more means to carry out their, sinister goals.
You bring up the point that many of us Americans are tired of wars. We are also financially in distress. Right now, our borders are porous. We have many problems here in America. And the idea of having to get involved in wars across the globe seems overwhelming as an understatement. And we're not sure if that's really our priority, because our priority has to be to take care of our own right now. And I'm curious, what is your answer to the possibility that we don't engage? What would happen if, we build a border here, we secure our country, we focus on America, and we let the Middle East deal with the Middle East? What would that look like?
Okay. First, I would say that America might say, well, we want to leave them alone. They won't leave you alone. That's the first thing. They're still coming after you.
How?
So by knowing that the biggest success that they can have is to pretty much defeat what they always said from get-go, the great Satan, America, which is why they have always had such an hostile, antagonistic, as an ideological system against the West, represented chiefly by America. But I understand. I'm a taxpayer here. I don't want my money to end up being spent on wasted resources either. But you should not assume that the issue in Iran has to be a war. And let me explain you why. Because the dynamics of change in Iran is a matter of what is the agent for change in Iran. What is the element that can bring down the system? It's no other than the Iranian people themselves. It's your natural army on the ground already, except for they are fighting the fight with no support whatsoever. You won't need to engage America in any kind of conflict. In fact, I would be opposed in principle in any kind of foreign intervention. But I do believe that if you bring in the necessary element of pressure on the regime, equaling the playing field for Iranians, you don't have to do anything much more than that, because the rest will be done by the people themselves. But we need to have a major shift in policy that has yet to exist in the Western world, because they're still in the mindset of cutting a deal and compromise and expecting behavior change, which was a flawed expectation to begin with, and simply proves there's a great deal of naivete in understanding that the DNA of this regime is one that it cannot be compatible and coexisting in the world as we know it. Because in their view, it's either you or them. There's no gray area. Therefore, what it is that, let's say, America could do
yes,
to make a difference. Not just America, but America chiefly because, when America leads, others probably follow. And the sense that I have always suggested a two-pronged approach, a parallel approach. One is a campaign of maximum pressure on the regime. That means in the form of sanctions, in forms of, example, putting the IRGC, which America has done that already. Your allies in Europe have yet to do that. But that simply means you're bringing more way of curtailing the regime's ability to have access in resources or do anything that they do regionally by the proxies or back home. Parallel to that, you have to have a component of maximum support. Let me give you two tacit examples. One of the key issues for those of us trying to coordinate efforts in terms of organizing whatever we need to organize against the regime is communication, which is vital. Access to the internet, free flow of information. And these are the kind of things that will facilitate Iranians not to be detached from the world and be disconnected from the world, which is something the regime is attempting to do all the time. And parallel to that, maybe find ways of giving financial means and support to encourage and assist in the case of labor strikes, which I think is the quickest way to paralyze the regime from within, by finding a way to fund it without a penny of American or others' tax dollars be spent on. How? There are many frozen assets, which is the Iranian people's money in the first place, that can be repurposed or allocated to support such campaigns of civil disobedience. All of this will contribute to a complete, leverage issue. But it's also important because when people see light at the end of the tunnel, when they see that there's actual solidarity, this time with them, finally, after 4 decades, when they see that this time the world is serious about telling the people of Iran, we had enough with this regime, we had given them ample opportunities to come clean, and they haven't. Meanwhile, the conflict is escalating, and this may become pretty soon an unavoidable conflict. The only solution that remains is put an end to this regime, but by helping the Iranian people bringing it down. But that requires some support. Many of these campaigns in other countries did not succeed without tacit support from the free world. The same case applies to Iran. And in that sense, you don't have to engage your troops. You don't have to spend your own money, but you can find ways of actually helping those campaigns within Iran to finally have a chance to be successful. It also facilitates the transition post-regime. Because I know that some of the concern is, are we going to have a scenario of chaos? Is it going to be a vacuum that is not filled? Are we going to have some situation of anarchy and instability? Well, what I'm suggesting is that this strategy includes a controlled implosion with a plan for transition post-regime into the next phase and has its component. And it also includes maximum defections from the regime, because unlike what happened, example, what happened post-Saddam Hussein in Iraq and de-Baathification, which was disastrous in terms of consequence, this time we're not saying that everybody on the job has to disappear. So long as their hand is not soiled in Iranian people's blood, they can survive regime change and they can have a place and a role to play in the future. So you're talking about a national reconciliation based on amnesty and not revenge, not on retribution, while justice can still exist for people who have to seek that. But in the spirit of more of a sort of what happened in the case of South Africa, truth and reconciliation, those kind of approaches, which means that this is the path of least resistance for those who can now join us, who are disillusioned, former reformists, who know that now we have to go beyond this regime, which is the collective ask of Iran. And in that sense, the world is lagging behind. Iranians today have come to the conclusion that as much as they try to reform this regime, it cannot happen, and are fed up with it. And they want to move beyond that. And that's where you have to connect the dots and see, as a matter of foreign policy, as a Western democracy, with the values that we all cherish, which is the same thing the Iranian people want, why are we wasting time trying to reason with a regime that in its entire comportment is the most alien to these values? And we as Iranians And me having lived in this country for almost 4 decades and appreciate everything that is incorporated in your system of justice and separation of powers and the guarantees that exist and the institutions and the role of media and this and that. And we would like to be able to do the same thing for ourselves in Iran. We are natural partners in this. Mm-hmm. And I'm just conveying to you a message on behalf of millions of my compatriots to say, if not now, when? How many more generations have to be sacrificed? How much more do we have to endure? And Americans should not think that by not us doing something, we won't be engaged. You'll be dragged into it whether you liked it or not. It will still impact you economically because the regime continues to, for instance, by supporting the Houthis, certainly disrupting maritime traffic. Certainly it has an impact on oil prices and what have you. So it's not like America can all of a sudden go into some sort of a introverted mode that we are disconnecting from everything else and then we'll be fine. That's not going to be the reality of things. But if you want to minimize the cost for yourself in terms of your national security interests, in terms of your economic interests, I'll go beyond about what it is that you're missing. Imagine the potential that would be good for American entities and business if tomorrow Iran opens its door and says, we are open for business, come and invest and help us rebuild our country. And it's a win-win situation. So we need to start thinking what a different Iran could provide in terms of our interests rather than, well, we don't want to be dragged into conflict anymore. Because that means that nobody thinks beyond the status quo. And we should start talking about beyond the status quo.
You bring up an interesting point, and that is, even if we don't want to engage with Iran, and Iran is already engaged with us. And I think we've seen, especially lately, that they have been very much embedded into our institutions here in the United States, certainly in the West, very much so in Europe. So we've seen what they've been doing on college campuses. Just the other day, there was an intelligence leak about, the Israeli potential attack came out of the United States. How embedded do you think Iran is already in American institutions where we need to be concerned and maybe even on alert?
Well, I think the footprint is becoming more and more vivid. They are committed to that. They know what the weaknesses are in this country and they're taking full advantage of it. You're not dealing with a dumb enemy.
What are the weaknesses that you think they're taking advantage of?
I think the fact that it's a little bit of a naive thought that they will not try to influence through their lobbies, what happens. You brought it up yourself. It's not only that, there are many other things as well, but they're at work. They're not only doing work regionally. They try to go as far as they can to Latin America even, and many places, as you mentioned, in Europe. So everything to try to have a role that influences maybe the wrong way in public opinion. Khamenei had multiple offices in Europe through which they fund so-called organization for this and that, but in reality, they're doing the regime's bidding in antagonizing foreign citizens, journalists, the Jewish community, or what have you. And now, most recently, we can see they're also trying to use. Of course, it's not just Iran. There's a lot of Qatari money into it as well. But there is a lot of effort going into that. They're not just relying on propaganda. They actually spend a lot of resources and time to bring up these kind of elements on foreign soil.
And the reason they are doing this is because they want to expand their political radical Islam to the entire world. I mean, that is the reason they're doing this.
It's not even for Iran. They don't care about Iran. They're using every resource that Iran has, not for the benefit of Iranians, but to, in fact, finally get that world dominance in terms of, in their minds, mind you, creating this sort of modern-day caliphate. That's the ultimate goal. And the final frontier for them to ultimately win is, of course, ultimately America, which was the first target from the beginning. Death to America was the first slogan coming out of the regime's mouth. It was not just a slogan. They actually mean it. They actually mean it because their ideology cannot survive together with America and what it stands for. It cannot.
Mm-hmm. They're in complete opposite ideology. Why are they so obsessed with Israel? I have a hard time reconciling the hatred that we're seeing from the Islamic regime towards Israel. And I tried to study up on it. I mean, Cyrus of Persia was very good to the Jews and actually recognized that Israel is the Jewish homeland. He sent them back there. Your father had a good relationship with Israel. The conflict between Iran and Israel seems to be somewhat of a new conflict. And I'm curious, why is Iran so obsessed with spending so many resources on destroying Israel?
Well, obviously, it's extremely based on this virulent ideology, which goes even beyond anti-Semitism. It's one way to say, if we can defeat and destroy Israel as one of the most solid allies of America, that's another knockout punch to America as part of their tactics and strategy. And so Israel has been targeted from the very beginning. And what's interesting in the meantime, and again, this is something that I want to insist, especially for your audience and Americans who may not know that the regime from the very beginning tried to create that atmosphere of indoctrination of Iranian youth into hating Jews or hating Israel or hating America. And, if you talk to people who at the time were kids in Iran, what they were taught in school, they had to stand there and chant all these slogans, which is obviously not what they believe. And we saw footages of Iranians in different universities or public areas where the American flag or the Israeli flag is actually printed on the ground, and the regime wants people to actually trample on it. And we can see people purposefully avoiding doing that. And that's a signal to you guys outside. Say, hey, the regime wants us to chant these slogans, but that's not what we believe. So that again shows that part of the entire dominance in a way of having one dominant ideology, antagonizing other religions. And I think the most obvious target for them is obviously Israel. So that perhaps to some extent explains that. But, I don't think we should spend too much time about what this regime is in terms of being evil. I think we should concentrate on what the Iranian people are in contrast to the regime. The exact opposite of what this regime is projecting. Iranians are peace-loving. Iranians have no quarrels with our neighbors. In fact, we believe that it is only out of cordial cooperations and relation that we can really thrive in the region. And that's on the basis of amicable relations based on mutual respect, completely different than what this regime is projecting. Iranians are tired of conflict. Iranians have been impoverished in the name of whatever this regime has been claiming. Today, the latest figures as in preparation or in anticipation of a potential conflict, the Iranian market has been on the crash side for the last week. As of today, it reached almost 70,000 2 months for $1, which means that our currency since the revolution has been devaluated 10,000 times what it was worth. And Iranians are not seeing the benefit of this policy of engaging, JCPOA with the promise of that money hasn't gone to the Iranian people. And Iranians soon realized that, none of this is benefiting us. So in that mindset, this is where we stand right now. And there is opportunities to make all of this change based on a complete shift of policy. So we're spending, I think, way too much time talking about the negativity of this regime and impact on the region, as opposed to spend more time on, where's the solution and what we can do about it? Because there is a solution for it. But I don't hear it being talked about as much, whether in American media or in government. And I think that's the part that we need to catch up to as far as where America stands in how to deal with this situation.
Now, I think what we'd want to understand is, do the young Iranians, which the majority of the population is under 35, do they have the appetite and the stomach to fight against the regime? Because we know there's going to be bloodshed. They know that too, and they're probably afraid. And so the question is, if the West does whatever it needs to do, and we can get into that a little bit more, what exactly, is effective. But if the West does everything that you envision that we should do in the West, do the Iranians themselves have the stomach to really fight? Or have they been despaired by what they saw happen with the other students in the Masha Amini and all of that? Are you hearing from them that they are willing to actually fight for the change?
Well, Marissa, they have. The whole point is that they have, with no support whatsoever. And despite the fact that they've been thrown under the bus more than once, and still they're out there fighting. They're still out there doing the fight as I speak to you. And the thing is that, of course, they have the stomach for it. It's not a question of whether or not they want that to happen. But when you have such a brave citizenry that, despite all odds, are still fighting there, can you not respond to their call for help, for support? Because you know what the address is. Mm-hmm. You know who it is that you're supposed to be supporting and empowering. And so that's very important. In every campaign that was based on a nonviolent change, there was a tacit support from the Western free world. I mean, I don't know where Nelson Mandela or, for that matter, Václav Havel or Lech Walesa would have ended without at some point having that element of support. And Iranians are already doing that. Mahsa and her peers, of course, were the victims of this regime. And it prompted an explosion of reaction. One thing that I can tell you is that over the years, the separation of every time there was some kind of a campaign or movement have been reduced drastically and are much more frequent and repeated all the time.
That's true.
Which means, in fact, that not only they haven't lost hope, but they're resilient in continuing the fight.
Yeah.
So that is one factor that you should consider. We simply need to equal the playing field for them so they have an actual chance for succeeding. And that's where the West has failed us so far, in not coming to realization that the solution does not lie in trying to yet again cut a deal with a regime that you cannot trust at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Do you
As opposed to investing on people who think like you, want the same thing that you have for themselves, and are your natural allies.
So do you think that when the West applied sanctions on Iran and then did a deal with Iran, and in return for that, they were pouring concrete into their nuclear reactors, and when we kind of let go a little bit and allowed them to gain more money, were they tricking us? Were they continuing to build nuclear facilities? Were we duped at that point? What should we have done differently?
Well, the IAEA has many times put out reports of how they were stopped from inquiring further into what is really happening behind the scene. So, there might be an appearance of things by the regime, but there's a lot of stuff that they do behind the scene that has yet to be actually verified. So there's been always that sort of opaque non-transparency, which leads to being not trustworthy at the end of the day what they do. Of course, they can manufacture a lot of sort of staging it or in appearances and what have you. But again, it's recognizing the nature of the regime. Because when you talk about the nuclear threat, I can use the analogy of it's not the weapon, but the finger on the trigger that you should be worried about. And in that sense, can this regime be trusted at all? Now, when you mentioned the issue of sanctions, again, I must say that a lot of people have been asking, are sanctions effective? Is it worth it? I would say if you are still in the mindset that your strategy for imposing sanctions is to force them back to the negotiation table to change their behavior, you're wasting your time. If you're saying, can sanctions hurt the people? I think the Iranian people know that regardless of whether there are sanctions or not, they don't benefit as a result. But they might as well tighten the belt with the hope that pressure will actually finally put an end to the regime. That's the price they're willing to pay. So therefore, the sanctions should not be the ends, but a means to an end of bringing an actual regime change in Iran. And I'm using the regime change word on purpose because it's got a bad name because you poorly executed it in other places. Just because you didn't do it the right way in Iraq doesn't mean that it's the wrong concept that should be abandoned. It is a necessity. But it's the way you do it and how you go about it that makes the whole difference. In terms of policy, whether they were Democrats or Republicans in the White House, they didn't perform that well, even when 9/11 happened. Example, Afghanistan. Example, Iraq. But Iran is a completely different story in many ways. And that's why I'm telling you that there is a solution at the end of the day which simplifies the matter. It's just a matter of who you choose to support and who you stop trying to insist on changing their attitude or behavior. That ship has sailed, literally. But now we are facing prospect of escalation of conflict. That is something that won't disappear by itself. But at the end of the day, the escalation is as a result of the regime in Tehran still. Whether Israel has to respond or the rest of the region has to respond or there's a tit for tat, it's not going to die away. It's not by saying, let's have a ceasefire. They won't stop. They may retreat. And in fact, tactically, the regime has retreated several times for two reasons. Number one, they understand strength. Every time you showed strength vis-a-vis them, they backed off. Not because they changed their idea, but because they reckon, okay, let's just pull back.
They have a lot of patience.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at the statistics of the number of executions in Iran from the time of the Obama administration and the Biden administration during the Trump administration, it was literally half the amount of people executed in Iran between these two administrations. What does that tell you? That if you're not tough vis-a-vis them, they don't feel any pressure. And of course, they will become even more virulent. They will become even more, I'm talking about the financial component of it.
Right.
Money that the regime should not have had if the oil sanctions were actually implemented, which they were not. So in excess of $150 billion, money in the hands and the pockets of a regime that used it not to feed hungry mouths in Iran, but in fact, support their proxies that may have in fact led to the October 7th attack against Israel.
What is your reaction to now the Iranians training with the Saudis and doing drills together? Seems very alarming.
I'm not sure if it's because of the Iranian initiative or the fact that as a means of frustration that no clear action emanates from the West, what are the Saudis supposed to do in the meantime? Try to de-escalate in some way. I don't think that Saudis actually think that they can come and see eye to eye with the regime, but they are responding to the immediate state of affairs. But I think, if anything, it's all tactical, but it doesn't change the nature of the challenge that we face. And I think still the problem is that this regime, especially now that its proxies have been amputated, it has now the only means and recourse to, instead of playing through the proxies, so they gain advantage without assuming direct responsibility, now they have to attack themselves directly, which explains perhaps why they actually decided to launch those missiles against Israel.
Despite all the terrifying news, I'm grateful to be sitting with you in a moment where you sound pretty optimistic, actually, because you feel like the citizens have an appetite to fight. You feel like you're at a moment where Israel has an appetite to defend itself, I guess. Maybe the United States is going to wake up and also help vis-a-vis sanctions or other concepts and ideas that you've outlined. And so let's go into the vision of optimism for Iran, the new Iran. What does that look like, and what role do you play in it?
Well, recently, before I answer this question, I sent a message addressed to our neighbors in the region, which was very well received. In the very same context of, imagine what a different Iran would mean to all of you in terms of our relationship with the Saudis, with the Israelis, and why it is that why everybody is feeling constantly under fear of what's this regime next move or what have you, how different it could be. That is part of the whole dynamics for that change. What is a different Iran? A different Iran, a secular, democratic Iran, is going to be a country that proved before the revolution that it could have cordial relations with our neighbors, which we did. And it could be even better in the future, because now we are living in a world where, Iran was still part of a world where it was very bipolar. I mean, the West versus the Soviet Union, it was a very different, in a geopolitical way of looking at the situation. And the fact that oil was such a big factor and the whole dynamics of, what the West had to do to make sure that it has access to that energy. And that has always been one of the factors in the Middle East. But Now you're seeing changes in societies. You're talking about steps taken towards liberalization. What MBS is doing in Saudi Arabia in terms of advancing more and more liberalization in some form, which we've never seen that in recent history happen in the Arab world. This means that today's youth in Iran or in Abu Dhabi or in Riyadh or in any of the other countries are more in that mindset. And I think a lot of it has been the impact of understanding that, of course, countries have their own cultures and their own thing, but at the end, the common ask is the same. And social media, I think, has played a great role in that, bringing people closer to one another. And I think in terms of that, Israelis know what the Iranian people feel about them, and likewise. And only in recent years, in recent months, have we seen a far more evident symbolic gestures vis-a-vis that. The kind of slogans that people chant in Iran, the kind of responses that we hear from the Israeli side. I myself, when I was in Israel about a year and a half ago, when I was talking to actual average Israeli citizens completely spontaneously, how much affection they had for Iran and Iranians, and dreaming of the day that we will have finally, beyond this regime, this liberation that will bring us as people together. And the same sentiments probably exist also in the Arab world next door to us.
How did the Israelis receive you when you went there?
Extremely warmly. And of course, what's interesting is that from a historical perspective, I think I was the highest ranking Iranian ever to visit Israel. Uh-huh. Ever since the temple was helped be rebuilt by Cyrus the Great, when the Jews in Babylon were freed, and he helped rebuild their temple. So it was very significant from a historical standpoint, but it was really a message of we value all these principles of freedom of religion. I made it a point to go to the prayer wall in Jerusalem. I made it a point to visit the Haifa temple of the Baha'is. I made it a point to go to the Vatican. I made it a point to go and visit a Zoroastrian temple in Houston. The point is, this is what Iran was like. Multi-ethnic, multi-religious, a true melting pot, long before America even existed.
And it could be that again?
And it could be that again and more, not just for our sake, but for the sake of our region itself. And this is the future that I see, that we can utilize our combined resources, not to buy arms to fire bullets and missiles at each other, but spending on education, on welfare, on, things that people need. Dealing with the crisis that we face, like the water crisis, for instance. I think one of the best experts in the field happen to be Israelis that have the technologies. I want to have Israel as partners to help us manage this and make use of their, knowledge, as opposed to be a regime that says they have to be wiped off from the face of the earth. I think most Iranians think like me, not like Khamenei. Yeah. That's for sure.
Yeah. Who do you think should lead Iran into the future if the people actually win and get what they need and what they want and what they truly deserve? Is it someone like your grandfather who was really tough? Is it somebody like your father who was very much in the modern mindset? Is it a Cyrus type? What is it? Is it somebody who's from Iran? Is it somebody like you who's lived in the West for 40 years? What do you think the best leader for Iran should look like?
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of describing what the next leader should look like, but what it is that our country needs to make sure that we can finally establish a system that is durable, sustainable, to the best interest of the nation. And in my view, I think that for a country or a region who, in terms of the mentality, have always been more individual-centric in terms of leadership, it is time that we become much more system-centric. Where the role of the individual, albeit in terms of having high impact, becomes less and less a necessity, because now you're relying on structure and institutions that you need to strengthen. That's my approach of how I perceive how Iran could be strengthened. So you don't have to depend and hold your breath between one leader and the other. and how good of a job he may or not, or she may do or not. So in that mindset, I think that part of the next day is to demonstrate that we start moving towards not only addressing the immediate, governance of the country with a process where you can have, unlike what happened in 1979 at the revolution, where people were really shooting, bullets in the dark, not knowing exactly what it looks like, what is going to be the consequences of that change. I want to have a C-SPAN type debate, constitutional debate, where every citizen can monitor and understand exactly what is being proposed in terms of what final shape the regime in Iran should take, how the Constitution incorporates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in terms of making sure that we put a complete end to any form of discrimination, and it's based in the law and the law of the land. And also for people to have a chance to actually have a real choice between what is the final best model. So I think that as far as it relates to me and my role, I'm only focused on being able to be, because of the trust that they put in me and because of what I've been asked to intervene, to be able to lead this transition, to help with this process. So finally, Iranians say, you know what? Now we finally have decided in a completely free and fair system of elections, our future and its leadership. And I think that I'm much more interested to focus on citizens taking a responsibility for their choice rather than having to rely on somebody else to make all the necessary choices, if that makes any sense for you. I'm not saying that leadership is not necessary. I simply think that by strengthening the institution, you have much better chance of succeeding in actually instauring a true secular democratic system that should go beyond the role of one individual. That's what I'm trying to work with people to understand, that as much as it's important to have leaders to step in, and I'm not shying away from that part, but I think it is important to understand the vision that I propose, that we would not have solved long-term the problem if you are looking for just a momentarily change, but we need to make that systemic. I really believe that we should not make the role of individuals more important than the role of institutions. It's a process, but that's my ultimate goal in.
Do you have people in mind who you believe could help build those systems? I mean, this is, I guess, a typical CEO question that I have as somebody who's built an organization. If you come in and you say, okay, we're going to start new, there's going to be a new process, and we're going to build a new process. You need those great minds. You need those great facilitators and doers. Are these people that you are aware of? Do you have some thoughts about that? And do you see yourself as kind of the great organizer? Are you more of the figurehead because you give so much hope, and you're their blood and the legacy, or do you see yourself doing both, where you're both the blood, the legacy, and the figurehead, but you in your mind have some people who you can recommend for the citizens to listen to and rely on to build anew?
Yeah, it's pretty much what you just said. Look, for instance, I think that the most obvious thing is we're talking about liberty, we're talking about the human rights, we're talking about democracy. At the end of the day, it's motherhood and apple pie. But does that put food on the table? Mm-hmm. People want to understand the mechanics of change, how we have a plan for Iran's recovery, how it's going to include opportunities for them to finally gain employment, be able to, feed their family and prosper. But that has to be something well beyond writing a constitution and voting in free elections. It has to be the understanding of what it takes to rebuild that country. What kind of investment has to come in? What's the role of, let's say, entrepreneurs or specialists in their fields, companies, technologies, everything that had the dynamics of that ultimately will tell somebody who lives in Balochistan, totally impoverished, how can I find an opportunity to have a job? So one day maybe Elon Musk come and say, maybe I put a Tesla plant in that area. Mm-hmm. Why not? And, but it's connecting with the people so they understand how that change can actually happen. So I'm trying to identify key players, whether it's in the political field or in the private sector in terms of the economic aspects. I'm working and talking to and consulting with specialists, legal experts. For instance, we talk about truth and reconciliation and a legal process for that, or people who are already thinking of constitutional projects as a proposed, project to start debating on. Economic experts who are working on strategy. What's the first 100 days going to look like? How are we going to sustain ourselves? Because sanctions are not going to be lifted overnight, and we need some revenue to keep the country running while we are addressing, what it is that politically we want to do for the country. All of these things have their own department and components. So you identify, and once people understand the game plan and the roadmap, they'll find their lane in which they can best contribute. So I'm trying to bring that into the equation. That is multidimensional. And of course, we have two separate phases. The first phase in which we currently are is what we do between now until we finally bring this regime to its knees that it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
And then we kick into the period of transition, which of course has its own strategy and roadmap. And this is in constant consultation with our activists at home, people abroad, and the diaspora is beginning to become more and more interested because now they're beginning to see, but we have to be ready for the takeover. And that's how you engage people into this discourse and these discussions.
What role do you think the Iranians in the diaspora would play? Do you think they would be eager to invest, go home, get involved, help? Are they still feeling connected to Iran where they would be willing, because many of them, like you, have lived here in America or in Europe. Do you think they will pour back into the country?
I have not heard so far any member of the diaspora, whether here in America or in Europe, say that if Iran changes, I have no interest whatsoever to help it be reconstructed. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to relocate to Iran, but there's so much they can contribute. But they also know one thing, that so long as this regime is there, not much can happen. So they're really waiting to see what's going to happen, to see when they can start contributing back to our country's progress. But I'm telling you, I've never heard any Iranians, whether as an entrepreneur or somebody running a business, or to say, I once was in Iran, I migrated here, now I'm connected to this country, which is my host country, and I never think back and look back to my country of origin. I have seldom found that to ever happen. Which again shows that Iranians have that sense of, I guess, inherited sense of patriotism in some way. You may be now a citizen of America or Canada or France, but you're still, at the end of the day, that Iranianness in you that is there. They can't help it. I can't help it. It's in me.
May I ask you then a somewhat of a controversial question, given that you've lived here in the United States for 40 years, and congratulations, I know your daughter is going to get married to an American. Do you identify more as an American or more as a Persian Iranian?
When I think of Iran, and I think that it's a country that we deserve better as a nation than what we have. I think it's three things that is important to them. First and foremost is freedom. Goes without saying. Second of all, they want to be accounted for and involved. So representation and participation. And perhaps the most important element is a sense of human dignity. It doesn't matter if you're Persian or American. I think we think it's important. It's part of this. And Iranians feel that they have lost all that they were, and they are dying to prove to the contrary of the perception that we are not that. And how could you possibly turn your back on that? I haven't. I've dedicated my entire life, not because there's something in it for me. That's not at all my ambition. But because I think, especially when I see the Mahsas and the Nikas, the way they're sacrificed, they deserve better. But I have acquired so much knowledge. I have tremendous amount of respect and admiration for the American people and what you have accomplished, albeit in 1/10 of Iranians' history in terms of duration. But what it is that is valuable in terms of understanding how you make citizens hold their leaders accountable. And you have the mechanics for it. You have a checks and balance system. You have the various institutions. And that's how you really build those institutions. This is a wealth of information that I, and not just me, more than 1 million Iranians who live in the United States have learned living in this country or other free democratic country. That's a wealth of information and knowledge and know-how that you can bring back to have that impact on the minds of Iranians who have always dreamed of the same liberties but never experienced it. We have. And that's the best antidote to that poisonous ideological brainwashing that the regime tried to do and has, of course, failed. Because people don't believe anymore all the lies that they were told at the very beginning. So it's very clear to them. So it's no longer a matter of hoping for it. I go beyond hope. I tell my fellow Iranians, you know what? I want you to move the needle from hope to belief. That's not a matter of hoping for a better future, but starting to believe that, hell, we can actually do it. We have the means, we have the resources, we have the talent, we have the know-how, we have what it takes, the ingredients for change, but we need to have an opportunity to do it. And I think once we're there, then for the first time we say, you know what? I take responsibility for it as an Iranian citizen. I'm not going to blame it on the Americans or the Russians or anybody else, sort of a self-pity type mode that we have often seen. We stand up there, we own it, as you say it here, because we know that finally it's our free will and choice in complete element of, how people know that this time their vote counts and is accounted for. That's my vision of a future Iran.
Well, Your Highness, you truly touched my heart. I will be praying for your people and for you and for the women. I think about the women in Iran that deserve better, the young daughters and the moms, and the people in general. I love your people. I love your food. As I mentioned earlier, I love the kindness and the warmth, and I had a feeling that I'm going to end with a thank you, and so I opened with a thank you, and I'll end with a thank you. And God bless you, and God bless your people, and may we just see peace, because that's at the end of the day, I believe what God wants. God wants all of his children to live in peace together, and so that we all prosper equally. And so bless you and thank you.
As my mother coined this phrase, light will triumph over darkness. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah. And Iran should be a beacon of light in the Middle East, as it deserves to be. For those who want to continue to understand what is happening in the region, because now we understand how it really does impact us even here at home, and we do know that there is Iranian propaganda on social media, what would you recommend for people like me who are really curious and want to stay tuned in to what's happening? Where can we get truth and information?
There are many verified and trusted, outlets that we can recommend. I will certainly do my part in providing you with that information. If they want to also follow my activities, I can share my website, which is rezapahlavi.org. And in it is listed all of my various platforms, Instagram, X, and others. And, what I'm posting every day there. So, that would be a way for them to maybe find out a little bit more about.
Yeah, well, I certainly will be following. If you're going to share some progress with us, I think it will be very interesting.
Of course, we will do that.
Well, Crown Prince, Your Highness, it's been a great pleasure. Bless you, and thank you again for everything that you're doing for humanity.
Thank you so much. I'm only doing my duty as a concerned patriot, but also not just for Iran, but I think something that could be a game changer for our world that doesn't want to see this sinister aspect of conflict and chaos and, living in threat of the next terrorist attack and what have you. But a world we can finally say, we can have really genuine peace for all concerned.
Amen.